So in our previous lecture we talked about few applications of control systems, and we learned that how a closed loop control system operates. Now here we will talk about the components that a control system can be classified into. So we first define the term system. So system is defined as the interconnection of components in order to achieve a desired output. So this means that if you have certain components and you connect those components in such a way that desired output is attained, then you can call that combination of components as system. So the condition for interconnection of components to be called as system is that you attain the desired output. Then a control system in fact is a system in which you will be having interconnection of components to attain a desired output, and additionally you're going to have a controlling action involved in it. So a control system can be defined as interconnection of components in order to attain a desired output such that some sort of controlling action is involved. So for example, a system that involves a person controlling a machine, like the driving of an automobile. So this is a manual control system. It is called as manual because humans are involved in the control of the process. And any system that involves machines only, for example your room temperature that can be set by a thermostat, for example the air conditioners, and you have geysers that are capable of maintaining the temperature of water. And likewise the third example could be the one that you for example refrigerator. So these are the machines that can be classified into automatic control. Now systems designed to hold an output steady against unknown disturbances are called regulators. So if there are disturbances present and they are going to change the output somehow, so we'll talk about disturbances in probably in the next lecture. So any such systems which involve correction of the output and keep that output at a steady state against the disturbances are called as regulators, while systems designed to track a reference signal are called tracking or servo systems. For example, the servo system or tracking system is we have an example of the antenna. We talked about an antenna azimuth control in our previous lecture, and that is an example of a tracking or servo system. And if the controller does not use a measure of the system output being controlled in computing the control action to take, the system is called open loop control. So we'll talk about two types of control in our later lecture. One is classified as the open loop control, and the second is the closed loop control. So the basic difference between these two is that you, in case of open loop system, will not be able to, or you will not be sensing the output which the system will be generating, and that is why the input will be independent of the actual output generated by the system. While in case of a closed loop system or feedback control system, you will be having the controlled output signal which can be measured by a sensor or certain instrumentations, and the value of the output variable will be fed back for use in the control computation. So such systems are called as closed loop or feedback control. Now here is the block diagram representation of a typical control system, a closed loop control system. So in order to identify the difference between open loop and closed loop control system is to look into any feedback that is present in the system. So in this particular figure we can see that a sensor is employed, and this sensor, what it does is it measures the output and sends the signal back to a comparator. So this particular block representation represents the closed loop or the feedback control system. While in case of open loop system, we would not be having any such block that picks the signal from the output or sends the signal from the output and compares it with the input signal. So in this particular figure we can see that there is a reference input, a reference signal which is fed to the input filter. So you might not be using the input filter in some cases, and in some places you will find filters as well. So you have an input signal which is fed to this comparator, or this is also called as error detector or comparator. So what it does is it compares the two signals which are being fed to it. So for example, if I talk about the antenna azimuth control that we saw in our previous lecture, let me show that thing again. So this is an example of antenna azimuth control, and we saw that there are two potentiometer. This one through which the desired azimuth angle is fed, and this is the potentiometer which measures the actual azimuth angle output of the antenna. So what we are doing is the theta I is the reference which is fed to the input, and the signal from this potentiometer is fed to the differential amplifier. Another signal from this potentiometer which measures the actual angle, azimuth angle of the antenna, sends the signal to the differential amplifier, and the work of the differential amplifier is to compare the difference, is to measure the difference between the two potentiometers, and then it will be generating error. So this differential amplifier works as a error detector or comparator, which we have shown in this figure here. So in the antenna azimuth control, this particular block or comparator represents the differential amplifier. Then following this error detector, we have controller. So controller, what it does, it measures the error signal, and corresponding to the signal that had been measured or the error that had been measured, it generates a control signal. This control signal is also sometimes referred as manipulating signal or actuating signal, because it directly actuates or it is, this signal is responsible for the working of the actuator, and that is why the term actuating signal or manipulating signal is also called to the control signal. And in fact, in the same example of antenna azimuth control, the controller part in that particular figure is the power amplifier. So what controller does is it is going to process the input error signal somehow in such that it will be generated at the output of the controller in such a manner that the signal is capable of actuating, or the signal is capable of allowing the actuator to work. So in the previous example of the antenna azimuth control, we had the differential amplifier as error detector, followed by the power amplifier, which works as the controller. And what power amplifier does is it is going to amplify the small error signal and amplify the small error signal into large signals. So the control signal will be are amplified using the power amplifiers in that case. This signal is then fed to the actuator. Now in the antenna azimuth example, we have motor as the actuator. So as I told you before, that actuator could be a motor, DC motor, a servo motor, or any mechanical process that is going to control the plant or the process. And the process could be the things that we have already discussed in the antenna azimuth example. The process was the azimuth angle. So theta was the angle that we were trying to control. Okay, there is a slight correction. So this particular signal is not called as manipulating signal or actuating signal. The output of the actuator is called the actuating or manipulating signal. So this is a correction. The output of the actuator is termed as the actuating or manipulating signal, which is going to operate the process. And this process could be other like heating, cooling, steering, or mixing, or whatever process that you desire to control. Then from the process we measure the output using sensors. So whatever process output is generated, or the output that we get from the process is sensed by a sensor. So you will be having an instrumentation of feedback block, a feedback arrangement that would be responsible for sensing the output which is generated by the process. And the importance of this sensor or feedback element is that if we are not capable of sensing the output that is being generated by the process, then we cannot automate the process. So in order for the process to be automated, so from the output we have the signal fed to the sensor. This sensor in fact senses the actual output and compares it with the desired output. So this reference signal can also be termed as desired output, or the output what we desire the process to attain, and that is why the name desired output. So I guess this is clear to all. डू एनीवन? हाँ जी जी। हाँ, तो इसमें देखिए मैं स्टेप बाय स्टेप पूरे इसको इम्प्लीमेंट करता हूँ। देखिए यहाँ पे थीटा आई जो है ना इस पोटेंशियोमीटर में, दिस इज द रेफरेंस इनपुट। ठीक है। इसके बाद आपने क्या किया, पोटेंशियोमीटर में वोल्टेज जनरेट कराए, क्योंकि मैकेनिकल इनपुट था। पोटेंशियोमीटर क्या करता है, मैकेनिकल इनपुट को इलेक्ट्रिकल आउटपुट में कन्वर्ट करता है। तो यहाँ पे आपको इलेक्ट्रिकल सिग्नल मिले एट द आउटपुट ऑफ द पोटेंशियोमीटर। सो दिस करस्पॉन्ड्स टू द दिस इनपुट विद अ प्लस साइन। तो ये पोटेंशियोमीटर का जो आउटपुट आपको मिल रहा है थीटा आई इन टर्म्स ऑफ इलेक्ट्रिकल सिग्नल, वो ये वाला पार्ट है, ये इनपुट। फिर आपने आपके पास जो कंपैरेटर ब्लॉक रिप्रेजेंटेशन कंपैरेटर का है, ये इसको एरर डिटेक्टर कहते हैं कंट्रोल लैंग्वेज में, कंट्रोल सिस्टम लैंग्वेज में आप इसको एरर डिटेक्टर कहेंगे। तो ये यहाँ पे आपके पास डिफरेंशियल एम्पलीफायर है। ये ऑप एम्प होता है, फर्स्ट ईयर इलेक्ट्रॉनिक्स में आप लोगों ने पढ़ा होगा। ऑप एम्प यूज़ करते हैं इन सच ए अरेंजमेंट दैट इट गिव्स द डिफरेंस बिटवीन दी वोल्टेजेस विच आर फेड एज इनपुट टू इट। तो दो टर्मिनल पे आप वोल्टेज देते हैं डिफरेंशियल एम्पलीफायर के, उन दोनों के डिफरेंस को आउटपुट देता है डिफरेंशियल एम्पलीफायर। तो ऑप एम्प का अरेंजमेंट होता है। अब इस ऑप एम्प या इस डिफरेंशियल एम्पलीफायर का जो आउटपुट सिग्नल है दैट इज़ वेरी स्मॉल टू बी फेड टू दी मोटर। तो मोटर उस सिग्नल से ऑपरेट नहीं होगा। तो मोटर को चाहिए, क्योंकि हैवी मोटर, क्योंकि एंटेना आपके पास काफ़ी लार्ज साइजेस होते हैं, तो उसके लिए आपको हाई हॉर्स पावर के मोटर चाहिए होंगे। और उस हाई हॉर्स पावर मोटर को ऑपरेट करने के लिए आपको हाई इनपुट चाहिए होगा, हाई एम्पलीट्यूड इनपुट। तो आप क्या करते हैं, फिर इस एरर को जो जनरेट हुआ है इसको आप पावर एम्पलीफायर के थ्रू एम्पलीफाई करते हैं, फिर मोटर को फीड करते हैं। तो यहाँ पे जो एम्पलीफायर है दैट वर्क्स सिंपली एज एन एम्पलीफिकेशन ब्लॉक। तो ये जो कंट्रोलर है ये पावर एम्पलीफायर है। तो कर क्या रहा है कंट्रोलर, जो एरर सिग्नल आपने जनरेट किया है उसको एम्पलीफाई कर दे रहा है कंट्रोल सिग्नल, ये एम्पलीफाइड सिग्नल है। फिर उसके बाद ये एम्पलीफाइड सिग्नल आप एक्चुएटर या मोटर को दे रहे हैं। ठीक है। फिर उसके बाद मोटर जो है उस प्रोसेस को कंट्रोल कर रहा है थीटा नॉट। तो प्रोसेस आउटपुट थीटा नॉट आ गया, यानी एंटेना एजिमुथ एंगल जो है उसको आप कंट्रोल कर रहे हैं। ठीक है। और कोई एग्जांपल लेके बताऊं रेफ्रिजरेटर की किसी की, यह काफ़ी है, समझ लेंगे आप। ठीक है। हाँ, बाकी और जो सिस्टम है क्लोज लूप कंट्रोल सिस्टम आपके घर में कॉमर्शियली अवेलेबल है, तो उन सब से आप लिंक करके इस ब्लॉक डायग्राम को समझ लीजिएगा। कहाँ पे डिज़ायर्ड इनपुट है, कहाँ पे कंट्रोलर है, कहाँ एक्चुएटर है, प्रोसेस क्या है, सेंसर क्या है, सब चीज़ें आप देख लीजिएगा खुद ही। सो मूविंग ऑन फॉरवर्ड, now in a typical control system we may have controller. Broadly, if we talk about the block contents of a typical control system, so important part is controller, then the process which is being controlled, and the feedback element. Controller is the element of the system which controls the plant or the process. So this is something that we saw in our in the previous slide. Process is an assembly of phenomena in which there are variables that are being controlled. So for example, in our previous example we had process as the antenna azimuth angle. So angle was being controlled, or in case of refrigerator this process could be cooling, in case of geyser this would be heating of water, and there may be process in which you may be dealing with multiple variables. For example, we took an example of chemical manufacturing plant. So there were 4 variables which were being controlled. So there can be multiple variables present in the process. Feedback is a process of measuring the output, which is the controlled variable, or the variable which is desired to be controlled. Feedback is the process of measuring the output variable of the system to influence this variable. This is a characteristic of closed loop system that distinguishes from open loop system and is essential for automatic control. So without feedback you cannot achieve automatic control. Now an important classification of control system is open loop and closed loop. So open loop system are the system in which do not measure the output, and there is no correction of the actuating signal to measure the output conform to the reference input. So there is a slight grammatical error here. So broadly, open loop systems are those systems in which you will not be able to sense the output and compare it with the input. For example, in the shown block representation of the open loop system, we have input which is fed to controller, the actuating signal fed to plant, and the output. So this is a simple representation of open loop system where you cannot measure the output anyhow. Then we have closed loop system. So such system includes a sensor to measure the output. So this is shown here. So we have a feedback element which is a sensor, and it measures the actual output and uses feedback of the sensed value to influence the control variable. Hold a minute. So in case of a closed loop system, we have a sensor employed, a feedback element which is going to sense the output, and this output sensed by, in fact, the work of feedback element or the sensor is to somehow convert the output variable in a form that it could be compared with the input signal. So if suppose that your input signal is in the form of electrical signal, like the case of potentiometer in antenna azimuth control, then the sensor you're going to employ should also be capable of converting the mechanical output into electrical form so that it could be compared with the input. So whatever sensor you're going to employ in the control system, you should have to keep this in mind, that it is going to convert the output, desired output, which could be temperature, mechanical or chemical form, into some form that could be compared with the reference input. Now there are certain advantages of open loop system, one of which is that systems are very simple to design and it involves no sensors and is thus economical and is easy from maintenance point of view, as you saw in the block representation, since it comprises of few connections of blocks, and that is why the maintenance is easy. Problems of stability is not a concern. Now these points become the disadvantages for closed loop system, because closed loop system are complicated from design point of view and thus they are very costlier. Where more often sensors are one of the costliest part of systems. So sensors may, in some cases you might be having sensors which are very costly. The second is that feedback is present in the system which tries to correct the error time to time. Tendency to overcorrect may cause oscillations without bound in the system. So an example of this was something that we saw in a refrigerator, the example of refrigerator. So in this example we saw there was an oscillation in the output temperature. So this was because the control system tried to correct this output from time to time. So there was a tendency of oscillation, though in this figure we see that the oscillations are stable and they are slowly dying out. But there are examples of systems which are very fast enough while they operate. So for example, you may talk about control of voltages in inverters, or there are electrical and electronic devices in which the process is required to be very fast in order to control the output. In such cases, what we have, the overcorrection, for example in this case, so the system tries to overcorrect, and this tendency causes oscillations out of bound and the system may become unstable. Disadvantage is that they are inaccurate and unreliable, the open loop systems, because you don't know what output is being generated, because you're not able to sense it. It cannot sense environmental changes. So environmental changes can be termed as disturbances. So we are going to talk about disturbances in our next lecture. So open loop system cannot sense the environmental changes. The third is recalibration of the controller is necessary time to time to maintain quality and accuracy. So for example, if you talk about let's say your ceiling fan. So ceiling fan is an open loop system. So I must have discussed about the examples of open loop and closed loop systems, but nevertheless, so ceiling fan is an example of open loop system. And what happens is, if some sort of problems or disturbance or some sort of restriction, let's say the ceiling fan with time after 2 years or 3 years or 5 years start showing problem in let's say bearing, or the speed what you actually were getting at the time when you bought it is different from the speed after 5 years. So this is because of the system is an open loop system. You cannot sense the speed of the fan, while if you somehow make this system closed loop, so the speed of the fan, where in the closed loop system you can sense the speed of the fan and send that signal, compare it with the reference input, and then you will employ a controller which will be increasing the voltage in order to bring the speed of the fan back to the desired speed. So open loop system will oftenly be requiring recalibration, while the advantage for closed loop system are that the accuracy is always very high, and this is because of the correction that takes place all the time. Such systems sense environmental changes. So this will be discussed in the next lecture, where we will talk about disturbances. And third is reduced effect of non-linearities and distortions. So this will also be discussed when we will be talking in depth about closed loop systems. So now if we talk about the examples of open loop system, one of the example is the ceiling fan, as I just told you. Then you have the lights at your homes, and there are many examples, so I'll be asking you about them. Then for closed loop systems, there are a few examples. For example, refrigerator, air conditioners, geysers. So these are the commercially available appliances that we had been discussing. So now I you write the examples of open loop, and one example of open loop and one closed loop in the chart section. So all of you please write examples in the chart section.